You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
And welcome to the Occult Rejects. I am your guest host, Jim the Ninja, and I'm here with my boss, Nick, the main man of the Occult Rejects, and Lisa, the main mad scientist, and our guest tonight, Absidarian Maat, who is bringing us the flavor of the islands with some Caribbean folk magic.
Oh, wow, that was great. You're hired. Thank you very much for inviting me on, Jen. I really appreciate it. This is going to be a fun thing.
Thank you for having me on, Jen. I'm really looking forward to this episode.
So Matt.
Well, I am also looking forward.
Yes. Yeah, no, I really was, because at least I know this is a topic I don't know anything about, which seems to be quite often. But I know that this is something that you're into yourself, Jen. So at least it was something that I knew that you get some sort of fun out of covering as well. So I'm really looking forward to this. And Absidarian, man, I'm really glad to have you back on again on the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on, my man. Before we get it started, just please plug your show and let everybody know where they can find your stuff.
Sure. Thanks. Well, thanks again, everyone, for having me on. I can be found on, of course, social media networks, Absidarian or Absidarian Maat. You could also check out Linktree and, Absidarian on there as well. I am most active, or most of my content is on Facebook, Patreon, and a little bit of Gab. I definitely recommend a lot of people to check out Gab. People sleep on Gab, but there's just so much information on Gab that you're not going to find anywhere else. But I'll leave it at that.
You know what's funny? I thought about going back on there again just every once in a while, because believe it or not, back in the day when I used to drop some of my podcasts and my videos on there, it would actually get traction.
Yeah,
especially like
BitChute. Man, he hasn't been active in a while.
Yeah, so I've maybe I can go on drop it in some of the groups or whatever. I don't know. But there was one point where I did actually. I had a Gab TV, believe it or not. We had Gab TV at one point on the Occult Rejects, because we were actually getting some traction on that platform. Not anymore.
Yeah, it's a growing social media network. A lot of people are jumping on there as well.
Nice. All right, so West Indian magic. Maat, what's your thoughts on that? Let's kick it off.
So, all right, I'll start it off. I was born in Trinidad, and I go there a few times a year, often. So I'm very connected to the history, the folk tradition, and there's so much to talk about. So we'll talk about some of the different streams today, such as Obeah, Shango, what is it called? Baptism, or spiritual Baptist, where they mix the Afro-Christian tradition. I'll also talk about tons of real life ghost experiences I've had. Some of the ghosts are the vampires, like the Sukanya. We got the Lijables, which is the female spirit that lures men to walk across water. We got the Duen, the unbaptized children with backward feet that chases you in the forest. We got the Papa Bois, which is the father protector of the forest. A lot of hunters experience this guardian of the forest, per se. There's also the Jinn, of course. The Jinn, that's not only limited to the Caribbean, but the Jinn has a presence there with some of the Islamic magic. We got the Chiral, which is a female spirit that died while giving childbirth, wanders in limbo. Well, yeah, we got a lot to chat about. So that's what we could look forward to today. Jin, you want to add anything?
I'll just say that was a really great intro. So my background, obviously I've said on the show before, my dad's Indonesian Chinese. So you might think, well, how does Jin know anything about West Indian folk magic? Well, there's actually a large population of Indonesians from Guyana and Suriname who live in Toronto. And so you just growing up, you just sort of know them. And then I realized very early on that our folk tales are almost identical. You can actually match one to one a lot of the spirits, particularly the female kind of like tree spirits, what we would call like Pontianak, which is like a ghost who lives in the trees. And it can be a ghost of a woman who died in childbirth, or Gangang Sera, who is also appears all over North Africa. So there's like a clear kind of um, epistemology of these ghosts that or these spirits or these kind of magical practices. And a lot of the Islamic stuff that came from the transatlantic slaves from Mali actually is very similar to Indonesian folk magic as it is practiced today. So there's a great deal of overlap, and a lot of Indonesians in the Netherlands as well as Canada practice Obeah. So you definitely have a lot of crossover. And then Tantra, which is obviously where I'm particularly strong in, that there's a layer of that in Trinidad, but also in Martinique, also in Suriname, also in Guyana, because of the large Coolie population, which are ethnic South Asians. But there's also ethnic Chinese groups who also engage in these practices. So I've had exposure both academically and just socially to a lot of this insider, more quiet stuff. So, and obviously, one of the first ways of any magician, I think, even Nick's talked about this, when they first start out, where's their first trip? Well, they go to the spiritual supply store, which are like botanica supplies, which are very, they're it's part of that continuum of like Mexican, Cuban, and sort of like indigenous and Afro-syncretic folk magic. So it all kind of lives in this syncretic soup. So that's pretty much where I'm gonna add to whatever Avstarian doesn't add, and I will have a couple of my own points, but I think it's gonna be really fun. I'm really excited for this, and thank you guys so much for inviting me.
Well, yeah, of course. Thank you. All right, it's back to you, Avstarian.
Sure. All right. So I guess it's good to define some of these terms so we know what we're talking about. One of the most popular religious practices is Obeah. So it has its background from West Africa, and I don't know much about it, other than like secondhand sources, but it seems to be very decentralized, as in, there's no set doctrines, canons, deities. It's just mixed based on the village or the local Obeah man, or like the head guy. That's oral tradition that's passed on in different practices of healing, working with magic, right? There's definitely a lot of black magic with, trying to hurt someone, trying to get rich, things of that nature. So Obeah is one of the most popular black magic practices. In Trinidad, it's a big melting pot because there's been so much different influences throughout history, from the European, British influence, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch. We have the Chinese, we have Islamic, we have African, we have South Indian and other parts of India that came as indentured servants after the slave trade. So my ancestors came in the late 1800s, early 1900s from India, and they couldn't speak English, and a lot of them brought their folk tradition with them, and it's what is it called? Mimesis in anthropology is just it's a mixing of different traditions to adapt to the current land. So so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of mixing. And another one that's popular, it's pretty powerful, is the spiritual Baptists. It's it's mixed of African tradition and the Western Christian tradition. And very, very powerful. Some of these traditions and history, a lot of bloodshed in Trinidad, and to Jin's point, there is a lot of common ground between the countries and islands in that area, because I have tons of stories of my family members traveling to Guyana, and even some from Suriname, so I'm familiar with some of the similarities in the tradition. I must say, there's something about that land. It's just so close to the equator, and being close to the Amazon rainforest as well. There's just really powerful energy in this space. And then another tradition is the Indian tradition from the indentured servants that came over from India. And in some ways, in my opinion, the West Indians, meaning Indians that been relocated to the Caribbean and Guyana and South America, in some ways they've kept the religion and heritage much stronger than their East Indian counterparts, because it's common in India when the pundit or the priest is doing a ritual or a puja for you, you just give them the money or you just give them whatever offering you have, and you don't touch the deity, or you don't go really in the temple or whatever, but the pundit does it for you. So it's a very second hand source. You need middleman. But in the Caribbean, the West Indians are a little bit different. They're more hands on. They're fasting for 21 days, 30 days, 40 days even, and they're participating in these pujas, these rituals, which is a lot has to do with like offerings of flowers, and also I should clarify, there's like two types of worship. One is the right hand path, they call it the sada worship, which is no blood, none of that, none of the dark stuff. And then of course you got the left hand path, which they're into like animal sacrifices and things of that nature. There's just they're very well connected, the West Indians in Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, with their tradition. They've kept the pronunciation of the mantras, the language, some of them, in the families. And I always thought, oh wow, that's very interesting. I would think it would be the opposite, that the motherland, India, would hold on to some of these traditions in their own right, which they do in certain instances. But that was just an interesting observation from the Indian background. Jin, can you want to speak on anything?
Well, I thought you made it. Well, thank you. I thought you made an incredible point about that, and I'm glad you said that. And it's 100% true that because the pujaris come from the family tradition, so it's like lineages of priests. They're not necessarily Brahmins, right? Usually not, but maybe there are some, but they're not always Brahmins. So they have more of a householder tradition where they pass it on to their sons or their grandsons. And so, yeah, they do retain a lot more of that. Like it's more a part of your lifestyle rather than a profession. So in India, like a lot of the temple societies are owned by the states now. So you have a lot of government involvement in the temple, the running of the temple financially, but also liturgically. So in these kinds of like more diaspora situations, I guess they would follow the original Shastras, which are the prescriptions in the Puranas for how temple or ritual conduct should be performed in the temple. So there are definitely different streams, like Abstarian said. There's like what we would call Dakshinacharya, which is like maybe they don't call it that, maybe they call it more of the Vedantic method, or that's more the normative right-handed method. But there's also a right-handed, left-handed method. That's what it starts to get a little confusing. So it becomes important to be able to discern and understand the deities that they are performing. Now, in my experience with people from TT and just West Indies in general, even the Indians don't always make a strong discernment between like some of the deities. Like a Saraswati, a Vedic goddess, she is Kali. Like it's the same thing for them. They don't really make a huge distinction. But for a tantric, obviously, it gets a little more. You have to be a little more. You have to use specificity in defining it, because then the mantra changes, the shastra, the worship style changes. It really matters. So I think for me, what I really am interested in is they did preserve what is quintessentially Tantra at its core, which is a householder tradition where you are practicing nighttime rituals, but also maybe in charge of a shrine. So I think that's really interesting, just like from a history of magic perspective.
Can I interject really quickly? I wanted to say anthropologically, what I have found, especially being, from South Texas, is that I think a lot of when people were having to assimilate outside of their cultural norm, to hold on to their culture, their language, their food, their belief system was existential for them. It what kept them sane. And so I feel like there was more of an emphasis to keep things so preserved back to what they remember, in order to carry on day to day. And therefore, I think you do have this preservation of cultural or origins in the Caribbean, especially the most. And then obviously within, Central and South America. I just wanted to say that.
No, that's
Great point.
really starting. Please go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just saying, great point. I just wanted to add to that I've noticed there's been a lot of, with the migration from a lot of people from the Caribbean and South America, they've brought the same culture and traditions in America. Because I was blown away the first time. I was like around 15 in New York, and my mom got bit by a sukuni, which is a vampire. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's from Trinidad. Like, why are we seeing over here? It's like, son, they bring these things over here, and they're continuing some of that stuff over here. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add really quickly that there is actually a tradition specifically preserved in the Caribbean, broad Caribbean, we'll say, that is not very alive in India. A tantric tradition. So in Trinidad, they would call the deity D Baba, and they would syncretize him to Saint James the Moor Slayer. So he rides a white horse. He's like a warrior who rides a white horse. And he's actually one of the 72 retinue deities of Bhairava. But this tradition, which is obviously very similar in some ways to, probably people are thinking like the Lesser Keys of Solomon or Goesha, it is in a way, but he is like a tutelary deity, a protector of the village. And in fact, they would often hang keys, give him keys. They will lock the temple and give him keys. But the point of my story is that this is only really found in villages in South India. So although it used to be widespread throughout India, it really only is preserved in like the South, in very like small, kind of rural, out of the way temples. But this idea of the 72 sort of time kings, or 72 lower retinue figures of the time kings, I think is really interesting for Western magicians, just because of the similarity and overlap and their dominion over things like the forest. Like he brought up Papa Bois. Interestingly, we also have Papa Bois in French Canada. So that's really interesting. And we syncretize him with St. John the Baptist. So, but not St. John the Baptist as the elder saint. It's St. John the Baptist as a little boy wearing the hair shirt. It's very specific. So you'll see a lot of like Métis and indigenous men will do a little prayer on certain things, or give a little offering of tobacco on certain trees, specifically for this kind of like Papa Bois, or they call him other names too. They'll call him Whiskey Jack, or there's a variety of trickster characters that are kind of syncretized together. But it is interesting that we also have a character like that in the US. They also have a character like this Brayer Rabbit, and sort of like the High John or the Tijan character from Louisiana. And so there's like an overlap between like what we would call like the Johns. So like there's the John root that's often used in hoodoo. That's obviously like a ipomia. It's a morning glory. And so he has a root to overcome all evil. There's a sort of spirit that has like the power of healing and the plants and the medicine of the forest. And then there's kind of like a trickster spirit, but they're all on a continuum together. I think that's kind of interesting.
Great points, Jen. I'm really glad you mentioned D Baba, because that was on my list of things to talk about.
I apologize.
No, that's fine. I'm adding a few things onto that as well. So I'm glad you mentioned him, and you brought up some really good connections with the John, the guardian of the home. So I'd like to add a few things about the D Baba. So the D Baba, I'm familiar with. There's two ways of worshiping the D Baba. There's the Sada way. Again, that's like without the sacrifice or whatever. It's just maybe some rum and some cigarettes. And then there's the other way, which is like a chicken. A lot of people do the chicken once a year. Mm-hmm. And I found it interesting because accounts of D Baba is one of the accounts my cousin's husband told me, and he's he has like he has this vision, the spiritual vision. He's like, he sees them often on he doesn't do it anymore. He's Christian, so he's the people that did it before my cousin's prior generation on the land, they were Hindu, and he describes them, how he describes them is just like the Hat Man, like with the brimmed hat, dark shadow with the coat. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting how there's that Hat Man connection there. Not with the evil eyes or anything, just watching over your home. And my cousin's husband told me a few times he's been awoken by this D Baba Hat Man figure when there's like someone trying to rob their home, so he would catch it on the surveillance camera. So the D Baba is really interesting as well. In that I have some experience with that in the States. I knew one of my friends, he was doing the D Baba worship, and he was offering water to it. So I've never seen that, and it's I don't know what kind of adaptation that is, but at the time, like I was in his space with this, and I was doing a lot of prayer and fasting at the time, so it was just like really in this pure vibe. And my car alarm just kept going off and going off and going off, and I'm hitting the alarm and like, wow, this thing's just not going off. So let me go check out the car. So I go outside, and once I get to the car, it stops, and I'm like, man, wow, something did not want me in his space, and I just something was off with what he was doing, and I just want to tie that into some of the worship that has come down. Like from for instance, Rudolf Steiner talks about how some folk spirits or ancestor worship, as it comes down, it becomes like either like a dead egregore, so like it's not charged or people aren't given it power, or it could become what's the word, like a vampiric egregore, like so it feeds, it starts to feed, so it changes the egregore. So I saw a connection with that in just my spiritual insight, that this was something that has the appearance of Bhairav, a form of Bhairav, like Jin said, in the D Baba iconography, on the image, which is a form of Shiva, by the way. But what I understood about D Baba, he was a folk hero in India that began to be worshipped as well. So I just wanted to mention that things that come down to us now, it's not always how it was worshipped or how it is in the current stream.
I'll add a little quick note to that, is that so in India he would be considered like a Kistrapala. So we have the same idea in Tantric Buddhism. A Kistrapala, it just means field protector. Just so the two words put together, that's how Sanskrit usually works. And so he is considered to live on the land. So I thought that was really interesting that you said that people would see him, because they would live, and even their shrines traditionally would be on the northwest corner of fields, or the northwest corner of monasteries, or walled sort of like villages, because that's sort of where they protect from, I guess. So yeah, that's exactly what he would do, and he would be sort of in charge of the villagers' day-to-day lives, but particularly with traveling, because as Amsadarian said, he is a Bhairava, so he is a ferocious king, but he's also part of the retinue of the time king. So it is a kind of form of Shiva. Like I always say, I've said to Nick so many times on the show, that's how we think of it, is like there's 9, but it's really an expression of 8. But those 8 also turn into another 8. So then when you add in the 9, it becomes 72. So, but it's all coming from time.
9 again.
That's right. So he's just not active. Time is not active necessarily as himself, but he has this expression of multiple identities that he takes that can like live in the village, perform these kind of like quotidian, daily, perfunctory, sort of like functionary things for the villagers, and yet it is a reciprocal transactional relationship. But it's like also because he lives in the land, or maybe beneath it, they are also feeding the land. So when they do like those like village pujaris, which is different than like a temple Shastra worship, but when they do like a chicken or a goat sacrifice, they're literally feeding the land. And so he arises. That's kind of how it is. So it is kind of like an egregore in a way, because it's all the different sort of geniuses of the land coalescing into a form. So I think that's kind of interesting as well, that he can travel. So it's not necessarily the same one that's worshipped in India, but maybe he starts to develop his own identity in Trinidad, not because it's necessarily syncretic, but because it's actually a different or distinct spirit.
Yeah, good points. Good points. Oh, you were going to say something, Nick?
No, I was actually going to say if there's anything else you wanted
sure.
to go
Yeah,
into.
yeah. I think I'd like to talk about the universal aspect of some of these universal archetypes, like the Sukanya, which is a female vampire. But the universal nature I want to speak about that I've noticed a theme, and then we'd see if Jin could share some insights on this as well. But the invitation. So like with the Sukanya or this female vampire, you have to kind of invite it in a certain way into your sphere before you're attacked. And invitation is not like, hey, come over, but in Trinidad, invitation is sometimes a interaction. Like the Sukanya, you'll be in the market on the day, and you'll see this female. She'll say, "Hey, how you doing?" And then that interaction, it becomes like an invitation into your sphere, without you even knowing what's going on. So I've noticed a lot of these things are like, whether invitation or some sort of relationship with the perceived victim. And a lot of it is like astral based attacks. There's a lot of power in the blood as well, and magical power in blood. So the Sukanya, just to catch the audience up to speed, the Sukanya is a female vampire in Trinidad folklore, and it's a real thing. I've experienced it in Trinidad. I've seen, and also in the States. But it's a female vampire, and allegedly this female says magical prayers. Then she's able to peel her skin, and then spiritually she can turn into like a ball of fire, able to travel, and then basically in nighttime, looking for victims to suck on their blood. They're known to store their skin on certain magical trees, such as the silk cotton trees. Mm-hmm. And there's accounts in the stories and the folklore, and even my family, they've told me that a common thing in the village is, wow, we got to find that skin. We know there's a Sukanya, biting my family member or neighbor. We got to find that skin. So often they'll find the skin, they'll put some salt, pepper on the skin. The Sukanya comes back right before dawn, right before daylight, and puts on the skin, starts screaming, it's scratching, it's burning, and she perishes. So that's a popular account of defeating the Sukanya. So there's a really rich tradition of some of the folklore, and it may sound like stories, but I can tell you, I've had firsthand accounts of some of these things, and a lot of my family members and close friends that have experienced this, and especially like my grandfather. When I was younger, he passed away when I was like 12, but man, he used to tell me stories of things he would experience, growing up in Trinidad in World War II, right after World War II. And one thing that always stuck with me was, he said, we were more connected to the spiritual realm when there was less electricity, when we were more connected to nature, and like spirits was just a daily aspect to them. It was no big deal. They weren't scared of it. They would interact with it. Like my grandfather, he would work late into the morning, so he would, he'd be coming home like 3-4 in the morning, riding his bike, and he'd encounter like all sorts of spirits blocking his path, but he knew what to do. For some reason, they don't like sulfur, so when you light a match or that light, they disappear, or they, there's certain a relationship with certain metals. Like he told me, there was a copper. There would be a donkey sometimes blocking his path going home, and he would just get off his bike, kneel in front of the donkey, and hold out like a copper 2 pence, or it's like a coin, and it would just let him pass. And Yeah, so I'd hear so many cool stories. Like one was with the Lejobles. You'll notice some of these have like French names, you know, Lejobles, Soucagnan. Yeah, there's definitely a French influence at one time in Trinidad, as well as Spanish. So the Lejobles, it's a beautiful female spirit. It's often depicted with one foot on the road, one foot on the grass. The human foot is on the road, and the hoof of the animal foot is hidden, often hidden in the grass or whatever. And it would often approach men at night and ask to walk with them. And it has it's related to crossing water. Like evil can't cross water on its own. So these spirits or whatever, it would either harvest your louche or like feed off you, or you'd have to help it cross water or bridges. And my grandfather told me one time he was coming home from the movie cinema late night. A beautiful and fair lady in a white dress walked up to him and started walking next to him. But you know, he's grown up like spiritually, where he quickly realized himself what was going on. And at the time he was smoking cigarettes, so he lit a matchstick. She immediately disappeared with a cackle and taunted him. "You get away this time, ha 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 ha!" And it just disappeared. And these were like common things, you know, in the 1900s, growing up, even up until now.
That was great storytelling.
Was there any association with salt? Not association.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned salt. So so how do you? So one of the questions
here.
So one of the questions I always had growing up was like, how do you tell if how do you tell who's the Soucagnan or whatever in the village? So one way, which was a popular folklore, was on the main road, you would just draw with a line of salt, and whoever was the Soucagnan couldn't cross that line of salt. It would curse, it would spit, and then you'd have a little sense that, hey, maybe this is the Soucagnan. So salt plays a big part in warding off spirits and evil. I got a couple of stories with some family members and spiritual battles, and using salt, pepper, onion skins, garlic skins, and fire. You know, that was a popular thing to ward off or enemies, evil.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Abstarian, because I think the idea of West Indian sorcery gets a little, it's not that it's inflated, because I think it has tons of potential. It's really cool. It seems really powerful. But I think that in like the more Western occult circles, it gets like sort of inflated to the sense where it's like this. And yeah, sure, it can be like a crazy mountain man religion with like you're summoning lightning and all that. But I think really at its core, it's about household magic, and it's about like what do you have to use to treat practical spiritual ailments that you are facing, like a Soucagnan, like a Diablesse, or like a Gangsters, Sarah, as they would call her in Jamaica. So I think that is the most interesting part. It's practical. It's like practical to deal with what you have, and then also practical to use what you have. So I think that's really interesting for me, is that it's like you don't even need the Botanica culture, because everything you sort of need, you kind of like are built in, like you have it all in your house, like to say this thing or this prayer or this mantra, and yeah, it's all dealt with. It's very much like Indonesian folk magic, and even the same spirits. Like we have like the camel toad. It's not a joke. It's like she has camel's feet or horse feet sometimes, and she has shackles. Sometimes she doesn't. Sometimes she floats. Sometimes she doesn't. And then the sort of dakinis or the Soucagnans, we would say that those are just unenlightened dakinis, obviously, because they're trying to vampirize you. But they often live in trees, like mango trees, banana trees. So there's a lot. Like my grandparents would never let us like pick any fruit trees after dark, and not even near dusk.
That's so weird. That's the same here. Sorry.
No, please. I think that's what's really interesting, is that I can see a continuity even in like where I live, which is like obviously far north, but like French Canada, there's clearly some overlap. There's clearly some overlap with the indigenous stories, and then there's obviously clearly overlap with the sort of southern, the hoodoo stuff, and then you're getting into like the Caribbean after that. So yeah, you're definitely seeing sort of like certain things, not necessarily religion, but practices, ideas, and maybe like the origin of like mythological figures, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
Elle, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say that everything you were saying is so parallel to the way I grew up. In that, when you said about electricity, my grandmothers did not really particularly care for it. You know, they try to turn everything off or at least not have it on. Have the windows open and always outside. We grew up that way. They almost had a saying that don't be inside so much it'll make you sick because of all the electricity. And granted, I mean, they grew up in the Great Depression, or they grew up outside. They knew how to cook outside. I think I told Nick about this, how my grandmother grew up cooking outside. There was and it was with fire and stuff. There was no electricity whatsoever. Outhouses, the whole thing, right? But then the other thing that you were talking about is we have, I guess, a lore or whatever called the lechuza. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's a witch that is disguised as an owl. Specifically, I think it's not the barn owl, but I think it's, of course, the name would escape me right now, but it'll come to me here in a bit. And when the owl would come, the owl would have a certain call. And when it would call out, it was basically to tell you that something bad was going to happen or that it is coming to claim the life of someone. And so one of the practices was that you would go bury garlic where you saw the owl, or you would go bury garlic in the area that you thought was the owl, or kind of like create like almost like not a perimeter, but something of a barrier between your dwelling and where you heard the owl. But when the other thing is that you would not converse with it, but it's kind of funny that my grandma would say, if you wanted to know who the witch was, you would ask her, ven por tu chile. And so the next person that would ask you for salsa or for chili or whatever would be the actual witch. So, yeah, that's all I got for my story.
That was great, Lisa. Thank you.
I remember back in the day when I was a kid, we didn't know of the tale of like not picking from fruit trees or something. What'd you say again?
So my grandparents would never let us pick fruit trees at dusk, because that's when the Pontianak, the vampire ladies, that's when they come. That's like where they live, right? They sleep there during the day, but so it's okay to pick the tree, but when they start to wake up.
In the weird reasoning behind it, I remember this from my grandparents' house out in Long Island, is that like they would say like don't, because believe it or not, there was bats back there. Mm-hmm. And like it wasn't even them making it up a line, because like eventually once I got like a little bit older, they had a cherry tree, and we would pick up ones off the ground and we would literally throw them up in the air, and you do that enough and you'd see these motherfuckers start swooping for them. And I was like, it was amazement as like a kid watching bats die for cherries. I was like, yo, this is crazy. Yeah, it was like one of my memories as a child. I thought it was wild.
But aren't some fruit trees pollinated by bats?
Mm-hmm.
And it only happens at night.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because they would tell us this.
Sorry, you froze up, Lisa. You still froze. Damn. All right.
It's all good.
Yeah.
They don't want us to know this information, guys.
Yeah. About bats. Yeah, you're back. All right, please continue.
Okay, sorry. Just that I said, I don't know how much it cut out, but that bats pollinate fruit at night. Mm-hmm. There are certain trees that are pollinated by bats at night. And then also they would tell us not to go into the trees at night because there were certain deities in there.
Mm-hmm. That was another thing. Sometimes they had a huge weeping willow, like gigantic, mm-hmm. and we would take them and go underneath the weeping willow. And we would look up inside, and if you threw them up, sometimes the bats would be in there, and you'd see them swooping for the cherries. It was wild. I thought it was the craziest shit as a kid.
The reason I say this is because bats are associated with vampires.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
so that's the whole like go between.
Mm-hmm. No, there's definitely a crossover, especially when you look at, well, I'm going to talk about Indonesia for a second, but like, yeah, they have huge vampire bats, they have huge fruit bats, like they have everything. So it's like a very, and then the TT's the same, like South America's the same. They have, I don't think they have vampire bats, but they have like a lot of big, they're pretty big from what I remember. I think that they're quite a large species variety. And so I think that, yeah, I think there's absolutely a connection, but I also think something Absidarian said was caught my attention was that the ceiba tree or the silk cotton tree. This is a very important tree in Mexico for like Aztecs as well as like Central. It's very like Mayan, like that is the Axis Mundi, that's the world pillar. But I think this is where I can bring something interesting. Is this super important in Tantra, super important in Taoism, and it's super important in just general Asian cosmology as a tree that where ancestors live, as well as where sort of God. I guess the idea is he kind of like the fingers of heaven are like kind of dappling the leaves, and so it has the most connection. It's like the most connection between heaven and earth. It's like the antenna, you could say, and it's very important in Chinese medicine. Used as generally, it's used for urinary tract infections and lungs, but it used to be used as an abortifacient. So that is kind of interesting. And it is used in folk magic a lot for cleansing. And I know Santeria, they use the leaves for cleansing. And I believe it's for Elegua, but I can't remember specifically. So nobody email me or DM me saying that's wrong. That might be wrong. Okay. But it's a very it's a in the mallow family actually, so it's a very interesting sort of because mallows are somewhat like roses and they can be interchangeable. They often have 5 petals. If you look at a silk cotton tree, it is kind of like crazy, very papaya orange. It has 5 petals. It's just in it, it looks like it's on fire. That's another really interesting thing about ceiba trees. When they're in bloom, they literally look like someone lit a blazing fire in the distance.
Wow.
Yeah, if the sun catches it just right, it looks like it's because the leaves are just kind of going back and forth. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
So yeah, I could. I'd like to talk about what Jin mentioned about don't pick fruits at dusk, because yeah, I could definitely relate to learn about that. I could add a few things on that. Yeah, there are definitely spirits in certain trees, and like the mango trees, the coconut trees, things of that nature. And I remember my cousin told me that his grandfather told my uncles, don't cut down. They wanted to build a house on the land. He's like, don't cut down these mango trees, all right? Just don't cut down these mango trees. So what happened? My grandfather passes away, and what do? My cousin wants to build a house. He cuts down the mango tree. Like a few days after, my aunt just wakes up paralyzed with this black shadow pressing on her, and she couldn't move. And he just says, "Why did you interfere with my tree?" Well, in the Trini accent, "Why did you interfere? Why interfere with my tree?" And it basically threatened to kill the family within 40 days, and then they had to do what they had to do to survive. But it was like a movie. They would try to get the priest over to do the ceremonies and whatever. There'd be a black dog comes out of nowhere, just tackles this priest, and he's a little crippled. He can't even get to finish the ceremony, but he makes it on time for the timing of the moon. And then they do what they got to do, and they keep this spirit at bay. But there's something also I want to talk about is the people that they're connected to the land and the homestead, is they understand the sacred boundaries between day and night, work and rest, physical and spiritual. Is anyone familiar with the nocturnal dew or Nostoc? The nocturnal dew?
Oh.
Okay. Well, so I'll just say just a little context and background. When I was younger and visiting family in Trinidad, I remember one late evening while we were gathered outside, an elder aunt saying to my cousin, who was a new mother and had a baby daughter, cover her head. Don't stay outside too long. Bring her inside soon. And I was like, why is she covering her head? She replied, the dew. So I knew right away what she meant without having to explain. So you ever seen the fresh dew in the grass or in the garden in the morning? So yeah, there you go.
Yes,
Even if it didn't
yes.
rain the night before, there'll be some morning dew. Where's this moisture coming from? So spiritually, the moon rules over the night, and the element is water, which is related to the astral plane. And the Nostoc in the Western tradition is nocturnal dew. This is from Adriana, this anthroposophist, so I'm quoting from. Nostoc is what the ancients called the unconscious atavistic dew, connected to the moon and what human beings experience in the night. It is connected to the past, and it is the dew of the alchemist and the unconscious inspiration we receive from spiritual worlds, which enters into our daily life when we wake up in the morning. It is the dream consciousness of our karma, right? So atavistic, if audience is not aware, it's referring to a recurrence or a reversion of a past style, manner, outlook, approach, activity, or practice. Sometimes it's looked upon as not evolved, so it's devolved. So so I found that interesting with the dew. Is connected with don't pick fruits at the night. This is a very spiritual time where the activity is increased and things go bump in the night. So I thought that was interesting.
That's incredibly interesting. I didn't know about the dew, so even the Western or the Caribbean version. So thank you for telling us. I did want to add one thing that I thought was interesting a little bit earlier, but also related to the fruit trees, is there's a lot of spells. I'm not talking about Tantra, but sometimes people will call it Tantra, but it's not really Tantra. That's really black magic. It's where you contract the spirit of the fruit trees. So like those kind of Sukriyant, the female vampires, and you contract them for not just for enemies, but also for love, to make people fall in love with you, or to win the lottery, or different things like that. And so one thing I know for Indonesians or people from Suriname or Guyana will understand this, is that they put the golden nails, susuk is what we call it in Bahasa. So they put golden nails into the tree right at dusk. And usually they speak their name 3 times, and then they tie a red string around it, and then a red string around their toe. And so the red string is never to come off. Otherwise, then it's like fair game. But for as long as the red string is unbroken between the tree and the toe, meaning that like each individual string is still intact and the nail is still intact, then you can ask for favors or gifts. So I think that's really interesting, because it's like they are such a presence. So there's like a whole magical system that's developed like around and with them, using higher technology, like higher tantric ideas, higher tantric philosophy, but like in a very worldly way, we'll say.
So I'd like to tie that into something called the Buckman. The Buckman is something in the Caribbean. It's basically dwarf, a dwarf people, a tribe from Guyana, and they're like a small tribe of dwarfs, and they're able to grant you wishes if you take care of them and you feed them. So the legend and the tale always goes, they start off with just like some fruits, just give me some fruits, and then it evolves into, okay, can I get a chicken, until it gets into your firstborn. That's often what's been told in the stories. And a lot of times they get success by this. So you'll see someone in the village have a thriving business that's so competitive, and people are like, man, that's great. What's he doing? And they'll say, oh, he has a buck. That's something common. So I was just curious, is it called the buck in Guyana? Because I know there is some similarities. Like the Sukini is called a fire ras in Guyana.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Know that.
So I don't actually know the term for like that specific category of beings, but we have the exact same idea in Buddhism, the exact same idea in Indonesia. So they would just be like yakshas, or just like small kind of like they're just, well, there's actually Jamaican idea that's very similar, the Mami Wata. So she is like the mermaids of the clear and sweet water. So that's how they start out too, like beautiful. They'll maybe have sex with you or whatever, and it's like it's all good, it's all good, you're just giving them perfume and fruits, and then they want something more, then they want something more, but then they're granting you a little more. So I think I think there's definitely a continuity. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, I just can't think of what they're actually called.
Gotcha. All good. All good. Yeah, I'm sure there is some similar term in Guyana and Suriname for, because it's coming from that area.
Yeah.
Maybe to call it a different tribe of maybe the indigenous name, but I always thought that was a very interesting tale.
Well, the Yakshas are in charge, or those like kind of gnome-like nature spirits. They're in charge of the earth treasury. That's how we would describe it. In like, obviously, this from the Puranas.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it makes sense, even in that cosmology, that you would have like they're a little race of dwarf-like bankers, kind of, that live under the earth.
Oh, what's wrong with the short people? Playing around.
No, it's all good.
No, keep going, Jen. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, that's okay. I just was saying, like, it does also make sense. Like, even in the broader, like, Puranic cosmology, you could just say they're yakshas. They're like the bankers. Their king is Kubera, so he doesn't grant any of these like lower wishes, but his hosts, they can. So that's also like tying back to the Debaba thing. Like, what are these like nature spirits if not hosts of a greater deity? I think that's an interesting concept.
Mm.
Yeah, very good concept. Very good indeed. They're definitely connected. I think there's sometimes a chain between the different beings or hierarchies for sure. What did I want to chat about? So there's also the Dwen, right? So there's it's traditionally it's unbaptized children that die, and these spirits, they have backward feet, and they're often seen in forests in groups or single. And Dwens are known to chase you to get you frightened and scared, and then get you lost, and you're found dazed and confused in thorny patches of the forest. And I was always like, what's the point of that? Like, they're just scaring people, and people would come out with like white hair, and like it's a constant theme that you hear, like, oh man, this guy, 24-year-old had full black head of hair, comes out the forest with full head of white hair. So he was obviously very scared and whatnot. And then I just think maybe it's loosh harvesting. It's just getting, there's a high energy. If it's not blood, it's just your emotional energy, your loosh, right? So that's a theme I've seen with like trying to figure out the why. Like why are these entities acting the way that they do, or what's the purpose? I get the blood part. It's the electric energy, the spiritual energy contained in the magnetic properties. So I could see that, but it also ties into emotional energy, going from fear, things of that nature.
No, that 100% makes sense to me. Like, you would have spirits that cannot pass, and I think that that's something interesting about like the Caribbean and like maybe the South. You could say like the continental part of North America. That's like where Lisa lives, or like Mexico, or all of that. I think that there is like an energy there because it is equatorial, as you said in the very beginning. And so I think that maybe it's actually harder for this, if I'm like, it's just a theory, but maybe it's harder for spirits to pass through fully, or maybe people are more engaged with them, so they're more readily apparent, like they can more readily appear, whereas in North America they don't. It seems to be, for me, it seems to be like a lot more, yeah, they're probably here, but most people aren't necessarily having like daily experiences, or like, especially with these other classes. Like, I think people have a lot of like what they think of as ghost experiences, but few people have experience with like these greater entities, or they don't know how to define them. So I think that that's kind of interesting.
Yes, indeed. And I like to just tie in, it just seems some of these spirits are in, like, to your point, like purgatory, like in a state of limbo between death and the afterlife, with the Charail, which is a female that's died in childbirth. That's such a powerful experience, death and life right there. The Dwen, these unbaptized children. So yeah, there's a theme of restless spirits, and in Trinidad, a common practice is from a historical standpoint with like the Spanish, for example, the Spanish would sacrifice their firstborn child with their treasure, like their gold, and in different parts of the land and whatnot. This was Spanish magic, and there's accounts that I've come across from family members and just people talking about that have dreams about, oh, there's some buried treasure in my backyard, but you're always told, don't dig that up, just leave it alone. You don't want to touch that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even my dad told me he was in Guyana at one point, and I gotta say, Guyana is the charge, the vibration of that space. It's so close to the equator, and Amazon rainforest is just so much pristine, lush greenery. And he was there, and at one time he was staying by his friend's estate, and there was a strange Dutchman that came by, and then like he did whatever chance he had to do, and some like chests came up with like coins and certain things, and then he was basically asking who wants to do trades, like a deal. And the people on the line, I was like, no, we're good. We're good. Keep it moving, bro. Keep it moving. And he's like, all right, I'm going to go. And then he started saying his mantras or whatever he was saying in his prayers. And some of the treasure was not going back. And he looked around and he was like, somebody picked up one of my coins. And if you don't want trouble, you better return that coin like right away. And it took him a little while or whatever, but someone actually, came forward with one of those coins and just want to tie that in. Then he left after that or whatever, but it could have been worse. But yeah, there's a lot of like magic with the family members. In Trinidad, one of the superstitions is your firstborn is very, very powerful, especially firstborn sons are targeted sometimes in magic and attacks. So it's a really interesting with some of the superstitions and the science behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that's a great place to maybe discuss a little bit before we end. Is that, sorry, Nick, I know I'm taking your job. Is that maybe we talk about like the Obeah man and like who that is and how he becomes, who he is and why he is the way he is. Because I think this idea of like we have that idea too of like a child, like an unbaptized child deity that protects treasure. This is more of a Thai thing, but it's very popular in all of Asia. It's called a kumintong. And so it's like a little child spirit, very Egregore, that you feed. A lot of people feed it blood. I'm not saying to do that. I don't have one, so, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that's something people do. Or they feed it food, or they give it toys and like cologne and all that stuff. So they treat it like a real child, and it supposedly can do like little jobs for you once you get it to be like powerful or matured enough. And so yeah, it totally makes sense to me in a metaphysical way that like I'm not saying child sacrifice like for treasure, but I'm just saying like I get why they would do that and then create like a sort of a jinn, you could say, or an egregore, or like a protector spirit to guard that treasure. And there are, obviously you cannot really discuss the Caribbean without discussing the British West India Corporation. So, and just like the unbelievable role that they played in sort of shaping both modern like the piracy of the time, but also like the inter-island commerce. It's also interesting to note about Obeah Man is that Duddy Bookman, who is one of the, I would say the chief, they call him the chief Bokor, so the chief sorcerer. He led the ritual before the slaves went to war with the French in Haiti. He was actually from Trinidad originally, but his father was a British Jamaican, and his mother was an Afro-Arawak woman from Jamaica. So he actually brought these kind of new rituals with what became incorporated into voodoo. I'm just saying that there was the magic and the inter-island trade, they're both very interlinked. like even the treasure stuff, like they would have the sorcerers on the ships to not just navigate weather, but also to find these hidden treasures or protect them with like gas or like sigils or whatever they're doing. So I just think that that's kind of interesting as well. I don't know if you have anything to add. I'm sorry I rambled a little bit, but
No, don't apologize. Absidaran, got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me see. Let me just get my thoughts together here.
Sorry about that, putting you on the spot.
No, it's all good. No, it's all good. No, nothing at the moment. What else can we talk about? Is there, and you guys had any questions to help direct, some of what we're talking about?
I was going to interject a little bit with, I know that you've talked about, I've heard of Duande, Tata Duande, as being part of the Mayan, at least from the Yucatan area. But then also you see in the Mexica, which is central Mexico, Aztec. And they have also the belief of children that have died either in childbirth or before baptism, or not baptism because it was pre-Spanish, but I think also it carried over to when the Spanish conquest, and I'll tell you why here in a second, is that they believe the souls of the children were the monarch butterflies.
that's
and
really
that and that obviously with the monarch butterfly they migrate down and they all land in this specific area of central Mexico during All Souls Day. And so it is between October 31st and November 2nd when all of the monarchs have made their journey all the way down to central Mexico. And they basically swarm this one area and completely cover all the vegetation, all the trees and everything. And it is said that is the children who have died or, the souls of the children, and they have returned. So it when you said that about the children, it reminded me of the belief system of the Mexica and the Mayans.
There's something absolutely to what you just said, Lisa, but then also what Absidarian said about like how people on the land will have like a reference of a frame of time that is outside of our sort of modern conceptual time. They're kind of connected to the cycles. So like that transmigratory cycle of the butterfly, they're going to be aware of that. They're going to understand that it's a sign. They're going to understand why it's a sign, what it means. And they've assigned a whole cosmological story to it. So I think that's what I was trying to say about the Obeah man. Like, who is he? He's not people will say it's a shaman. It's not really a shaman. He's really a sorcerer. This is kind of what sets Obeah apart from maybe the more, you could say, indigenous oriented religions, or even the more institutional forms of voodoo or Santeria from the other islands, is that he's really a sorcerer. He's it's almost always a sorcerer for hire. And interestingly, if you look at the more Christian oriented Obeah, they say that they're Moses. Often that's a dream they'll have, is like they'll have a dream of Moses, like the Christian Moses coming down from the mountain, and he will give them not any kind of physical thing, but it's often knowledge. So it's kind of interesting just from a metaphysical perspective. Like, you have this figure dressed in white, very like Judeo-Christian, but then he's a very popular figure among Afro Christians as well, because he represents the liberation of the slaves. So you kind of have this idea of like Papa Moses. I know in St. Lucia they have a whole myth and a mountain that they say that this is where the main mountain where he comes down. And it's also interesting in connection to Mexico, there's a tree called Angel's Trumpet. I'm sure Lisa's kind of familiar with it, Brugmansia. And so that also grows indigenously in like all of the Caribbean, all of the places we're talking about. So this is obviously related to the datura plant, except it's actually a little more, it's not as crazy, very powerful. Don't do it. I'm not saying to do it. So I'm just saying it's a little more contained. It's a little less, it's a little less like what datura is. So it smells really great. It has like an incredible smell, and it's like a tuberosa bush. So it's kind of one of the signs. It's like the Saint Lucy, Saint Lucia, like the it's like the light from the eyes. So it's like Moses. So there's a big yellow brugmansia. That's how it's considered. Is it's on the on a mountain. There's a yellow bush. It gathers. You could say monarchs. You could say hummingbirds. Then that's the dream. It's like that's the dream, and it's like the burning bush, but it's not really burning. It's just like all the God's creation or whatever, however you're describing it. So it's like all of that coming together. Moses is made, just like the hosts, maybe you could say, like the Sukions or the Dibaba. It's like the host coming into the one. Then you get he touches your forehead. You get some kind of dream, or maybe a waking dream. I've heard both things, to be honest. I read a book called Obeah and Other Powers, not in preparation for this episode, but in undergrad. And the most common story was actually gifts of healing. So it would always be about like how to heal, but people are complicated beings, so they don't always want to use that power for healing. They often want to use that power to make money, or sometimes they say the Obeah man is so powerful that he curses people simply for a penny, just because he can. So it's someone with like it's almost like a supernatural level being, but they're also human. And then also something Absidarian said, the black animals. I know this is also very popular in Mexico. This idea of the witch or the sorcerer becoming a black pig or a black dog or a black bird. That's very common. So you have this also as well. Like you have this same idea. And I think the most interesting thing to me about West Indian magic is how syncretic it is without sort of losing its identity. So you could easily go into a botanica, put together a box of things, and then give it to anyone on any island. They might use it a different way, but they would all know exactly how to use it. They would have you would give them an oil, a candle, maybe a couple roots. They would all know what to do. I do think that's kind of interesting.
Jen, you know what's interesting? When I lived out in New York, I used to go to the Bronx. This botanical out there, it was gigantic. It was huge, and like I was a ceremonial magician, and there was other people I knew too, even from the lodge. And then there was witches. So many different types of people went to that store because it's just the crossover. We all could use the herbs. They had tons of oils, the crystals, incense was crazy. Cheap as hell candles that were good, actually. You'd see so many different types of people going there just because of the stuff that was used in the practice was so broad.
Mm-hmm. A lot of this comes down to like Kabbalah fundamentals, really. It's just like color, candles, positionality, timing, incense, like all of those, just like very basic magic, like Magic 101.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah, when you're practicing, you're totally right, my man.
It's like there's no real religious category that can encapsulate what that even is, because it's like just taking fundamentals that are almost universal. Like, of course, everybody has their own system tweaks and their own cultural tweaks and their own kind of like individual mythology, but that's kind of all bullshit too, in a way. Because it's like it's so similar. Like there's just like something so recognizable, so universal. Like when I've seen like in Mexico or in Texas, when they do the salt smudging, where they get the cast iron pan really hot and they have the salt there and they sprinkle the herbs, or they do the spiritual bathing. Like we have that same idea. We call it mandi bunga. Like the exact same idea. Like my dad comes from like an Islamic country. You wouldn't think that would be an idea, but they do like 7 flowers. That's also a very like Latin thing to do, like the Siete Flores, like the Baño Siete Flores. So then you have we have the same idea. Isn't that crazy? Like 2 different places all the way across the world, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of years, the same thing, same numbers.
The marigolds. The marigolds that are used during Day of the Dead. I believe, don't Indians also utilize the marigold?
So that's a great question and great observation, Lisa. So in normative puja, that marigolds are one of probably the most common offering flowers for normative. It's more Krishnava or Vaishnava sort of style, but definitely it's very common. I can find tantric icons with them too. It's not so distinct, but yeah, hugely common. It's very solar, right? It's bringing that energy, that like fire of the sun, like down into the spirit, kind of, or down into the idol.
I'd like to add with the marigolds in the Hindu tradition, it's called Genda. So marigolds are also associated with Ganesh to open the worship, opened up the portals. Hermes, Mercury. And to tie in with the Obeah man is akin to Hermes, a medicine man, a bridge between the spiritual and the physical. There's a great saying I came across in Obeah. It's, if you cannot feel the spirit, you are already dead. So that just lets you know they're just so connected with working the spiritual land and even the physical land. And that was my key takeaway. Like, just to add on what Jin and everyone else has been saying, the connection with the land, the folk spirit, the culture, the multi-generational wisdom and tradition, the oral tradition, the ghost stories. Ghost stories are a big part of my family. And in Trinidadian culture in general, people hanging out at night, you're growing up with your cousins and you're hearing the old timers talk about stuff like you think they're making it up, but like, if you know what they're talking about, and you get some other eyewitnesses from your cousins or personal experiences, you're like, wow, there is something more than just the physical.
Very well said, sir. I think we'll wrap it up there, I guess, if that's all right with you, guys, and everybody else. Lisa, was there anything you want to add?
No, just I knew it was there. I had no idea how, like what Jen said, syncretic, how it basically blends all the different cultures, and it's fascinating, and that how much you see it in the different cultures over and over again. And to the point about at least growing up in Hispanic, or at least the tie in to very much a tie into the land. And a tie into the land means to honor your dead, to honor your ancestors who have died, and then also to be respectful of spirits and ghosts and stuff. And it wasn't to be so alarmed about, but it was more of a part of your life.
100%. I do a sir offering every morning, which is like burned cedar. Yes, Tibetans
nice,
use that too.
Like
so yeah, it's weird, right, Nick? Like to use like Tibetans in like Central Asia, burn cedar for the spirits of the land and the dead, as well as like native people on North America. Just shows you that there's really one system.
I used to use cedar a lot, actually, for incense.
Because it works.
Yeah, I like
cedar's the best. It's my favorite personal.
That and Palo Santo I like a lot.
I like Palo Santo too, yeah.
Palo Santo. All right, so I guess we'll wrap it up here. Lisa, thank you very much as well. Jen, thank you very much, man. This was actually your idea, technically, I think. So, yeah, this was a great episode. I really appreciate you coming up with the idea. And Absidarian, thank you so much, man, for joining us and coming with the topic, since you were versed in this as well. Maybe if there's more, we can talk about it in the future, but I'm sure we'll definitely have you on again, my man. Real quick, Absidarian. We'll go with Jen first. Jen, let everybody know where they can find your work, please, sir.
Sure. I'll just keep it really quick. Thank you guys so much, Lisa, Absidarian. It was honestly great to have you on. And you brought like a really complimentary and like incredible storytelling knowledge. So thank you for being like that on my episode, on like my idea episode. And thank you, Nick, obviously, for asking me what my idea was and having me on.
I should have just taken the idea like, some other people normally do.
Okay, well, I'm on Twitter, Wukong Reborn, WUKONG Reborn, and then also I have the show account at Threshold Saints, but then you can also find Threshold Saints on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere you get your podcasts. So thank you guys.
Awesome. I really appreciate you joining us. And Absidarian, what is up, my man? Let everybody know where they can find some of your stuff, please.
Thank you. Well, it's been a great show, guys. Jen, Lisa, Nick, I really appreciate this dialogue, and it was really fun because this is not a well-known topic In general, it's really very localized. So that was fun sharing this information. You could find me on LinkedIn. Oops, LinkedIn. No, I'm not accepting any applications right now. Linktree. Absidarian. That's my real LinkedIn right there. Linktree. All right. Thanks, guys.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And tell you the truth, we still have Robert. We have Rudolph Steiner, part 2 that eventually we will be covering, and this time we will be getting Lisa on with us because she is a big fan of Rudolph Steiner, and she's also a huge fan of the Rosicrucian stuff. That was the other occult reject that I told you I was trying to save you for the other Rosicrucian stuff for. So we definitely have plenty of things to talk about in the future. So thank you very much, sir, and until the next one, everybody be well. Later.